friends, it's Dan. Welcome back. Welcome to another rulebook review, this time for the Dragon Rampant first edition rule set produced by Osprey. And I'd like you to know with all of my sponsored videos that this was sent to me by Osprey to review for you guys. So huge thanks to Osprey for kicking this over to us. And in fact, they sent this in advance of their second edition rulebook, which they'll be sending to me as well as a kind of like foundation to build on for that second review, which will be great to be able to compare and contrast the first edition and the second edition book. If you didn't watch my first rulebook kind of template video that I did for the Warhammer 6th edition rulebook, just to kind of give you an example of the flow, I will state here, my normal disclaimer will be that while we will talk about the mechanics at a high level, maybe just kind of giving my overall impression, some comparisons to some other game systems that I've played, this is principally going to be a review of the rulebook itself. That's something that I think gets lost in a lot of reviews where maybe the focus is more on the rules, the updates to the rules, eyes toward battle reports and actually like playing the game. I appreciate that content. There's lots of it out there. This is going to be more focused on looking at the physical rulebook itself, print quality, construction, layout, flow of the book, kind of like ease of use, things of that nature. So again, I will talk about the rules mechanics a little bit just because you guys requested that in the last video as well, but it's not going to be a deep dive. On that note, I'll have a link down in the description to a channel I recommend that I've been subscribed to for a long time. The host's name is Alec. He's the host of the War Games Hobby channel, and he's done some fantastic videos that I highly recommend on game systems like Dragon Rampant that are not only an overview of the rulebook, but he has kind of how to play videos for games like Dragon Rampant, Hail Caesar, Saga, and has been immensely helpful for me in kind of like staying up to date on rules of game systems that I don't necessarily have that much time to play these days, but I do like to keep abreast of all the info that's out there. So check them out. Again, link down in the description. So the book itself, the rules were published in 2015. I'm sure I'll say a bunch of times that they've been supplemented now, updated with a second edition of the book. And the impression I have, it's a very small book, right? Easy to read. I got this late in the afternoon yesterday. It's 65 pages, and I got through it in an hour. So it's incredibly approachable. The rule set was written with the intention of them being easy to pick up, easy to play, and kind of like with fun in mind. This is not designed to be a competitive rule set for use in like tournaments. Stuff like that. This is meant to be a very casual beer and pretzels kind of game. My version is softcover. I don't know if there is a hardcover version available. That would certainly be my recommendation for any gaming rule set that you intend to like take with you to games. I know plenty of people that keep the rule book at home, maybe bring a PDF with them to the game, like on a phone or a tablet or something. But if you're bringing a rule book, I would always recommend, if you can, to upgrade to a hardback just because you're going to get banged around. Speaking of construction, this is a glued format, which is not a surprise given the size of the book, that it's really thick enough to warrant a like sewn binding method. But while that's not my favorite, it does keep costs down, and the cost can't be overlooked here. It says $20 US for the MSRP, and I imagine it might even be going for less now that they're probably not going to be printing this anymore. So anyway, definitely worth keeping that in mind as we go through here. So the rules I mentioned were written by Daniel Mercy, who also wrote the Lion Rampant rule set. He's done a couple of other sets too, like Dux Bellorum, I think we saw in the beginning cover there. And I really enjoy his writing style. I come from a background in rules. I mentioned like I played Warhammer a lot and played some games like Hail Caesar, Saga, and I actually have some rules writing experience from the Ninth Age project, which was a fan version, kind of the spiritual successor to Warhammer after the end times. And that had a very the rule set I think was fairly balanced, but it had a very like engineering tome kind of writing style to it, because they're trying to cover lots of outside cases to make a very balanced tournament driven rule set. This is incredibly refreshing to read, to be honest with you, because it is not at all that. It is not meant to be a tournament competitive rule set. This is a casual game between friends, and the writing reflects that, where it is kind of like in a lot of places just says use common sense. He has a really natural conversational style to his writing that makes it feel like we're just like at a pub somewhere having a chat about this rule set that he's had on his mind. He uses words like skelly unit and stuff like that instead of skeleton. That just makes it feel more like an informal chat. The flow of the book is quite nice too. It is, I mean, I said that the rule set is short. It's 65 pages start to finish, and it flows through. There's a little introduction section. It goes into unit profiles, which are all kept generic. You can see that here. It has like lesser war beasts, which can represent whatever you want, depending on what faction you're playing, or what, world you're trying to represent with these rules. Again, things like elite foot, heavy foot can mean whatever you want it to mean. There are some sample warbands in the back to give you some ideas to kind of attach names or themes to these more generic profiles. But as you go through, you can see, again, Lightfoot, etc. So it gives you these profiles at the beginning, and you'll find on reading it that a lot of them are quite similar. They have some subtle differences to them in terms of how they operate. Then it moves into the core rules. Then it has some more advanced fantastical rules, I think is specifically what they're referenced as, which I imagine is the key difference between this rule set and Lion Rampant, which is sort of the medieval equivalent of this rule set. And then from there, you have a little section. There's a magic section kind of tucked within the fantastical rules. You have then some scenarios and some sample warbands, as I mentioned. So the flow is very natural. It makes perfect sense that you could go through like the intro, the unit profiles, and the core rules, which describe things like unit cohesion, terrain, movement, kind of the orders system that's used within the game. And then after you have a couple of games, you have these optional, like, fantastical rules that you can start layering in. And that's something that we saw, for example, in that 6th edition Warhammer book that we reviewed a week ago, that they did something similar where they have the advanced rules, the core rules, which is great for new players, even if you have some experience with wargaming, to be able to pick up the basic rules and layer on the more advanced rules kind of at your convenience is a nice thing. The one thing I'll say as like a negative to the game system overall from a, again, high-level mechanics discussion is that it uses an activation system that is, I think, pretty similar to like Hail Caesar, for example, does something similar, where the issue I have with it is not the concept of an activation, it is the binary nature of it, which is that it's pass-fail, and if you fail, you can't do anything. And I appreciate the concept of trying to get to where you can represent things like, uneven terrain, or, weather, or people getting lost, or orders not making it, or not being interpreted correctly, kind of that natural chaos of battle. However, going to a place where a unit can't do anything if you fail can lead to some pretty frustrating moments in the game. And I know game systems like Hail Caesar try to get around that by introducing like reroll mechanics and stuff like that to make it less punishing when you fail an activation. But again, that's why I'm not going to like deep dive on the rules, because it could be that there are rules in the system that help you get around that, or that it's not as punishing as it might seem at face value just from reading it. Again, people like Alec over at the War Games Hobby channel might have better insights into that, and I really don't feel that I could offer any, I don't feel like I could opine on that until I've had maybe 20 games under my belt. But otherwise, you can see here we're going through the fantastical rules section here, and it's neat that they break out special rules with just a flat cost. Again, it's a nice, simple system. I'm not saying it's the most balanced on the planet, because, something like hatred costing 1 point might actually have different value on a light missile troop versus an elite troop. But there's some intuitiveness to that, and the point system itself is simple enough. If I flip back to the profile section, so you'll see that there are certain rules that you can add on that, of course, are upgrades, like mounted missiles, stuff like that, adding point values. But there's certain rules, actually, that are demerits that reduce the cost of the unit. So many of us are used to rules that just increase the cost if you wanted to add them on. But there are certain ones, like I saw one in the missile troop section that talked about, heavy missiles, or like cumbersome missiles, something like that, that made it to where it was -1 point for unit, because it was actually a demerit. So I like that concept within a rule set too. It gives you a lot of options in terms of flavor, right? What you're representing on the table. That makes it up to you. We went through the fantastical rules there. It's a quick section. It's only 4 pages long, 5 pages long, something like that. And there's this multi-page section on wizards. Right? It's sort of tucked within the fantastical rules there. And then I mentioned we go into scenarios, which I'm a big fan of. I have advocated for that for a long time. That's like the main problem I have with game systems like the old world, that I think that having a scenario-driven rule set is really important, not just for overall balance, but for replayability, making it to where you're not just mashing models together and trying to kill as many of the other side as you possibly can. So you can see there's a pretty extensive selection of scenarios here, some of them with some evocative names, right? And then the last section at the end here are some sample warbands, which take those core profiles that we saw at the beginning that have generic terms like heavy foot, light foot, and then give you some ideas of names or themes to go along with those. And I saw that online there's a pretty thriving community of people that have their own warbands that they've come up with, which is a cool concept, right? Knights of the Shining Citadel, that can mean whatever you want it to mean, but might mean what you think it means, right? So yeah, it's a nice generic take on fantasy rules that seems incredibly adaptable. And there you go. I'm going to actually go through and flip through it one more time again. It's a very quick read. We just flipped through the entire thing in less than 10 minutes at a reasonably slow pace. And I found that was the case when I read through it last night, that after just a simple read through, I felt that, like, if somebody was coming over this afternoon, for example, to play a game, I think I could muddle my way through a game pretty readily. The intro section here, that maybe the only things that I didn't like about it, other than the activation system, which again, that's just a superficial impression. The introduction section, while conversational, I really like, again, Daniel's writing style. It is speaking more toward people that have a foundation within wargaming. In the Warhammer rulebook, we saw a really extensive intro and hobby section to sort of set the stage, almost running on the assumption that you know nothing about wargaming, and explaining, what you're going to need, how to build up an army, how to paint figures, stuff like that. I certainly wouldn't expect something as comprehensive as that in a rule set like this, which is model agnostic, by the way. You can use whatever models you want, which I really appreciate. But just to have a little section there to assume for a second that the reader might have absolutely no idea what we're talking about here, I think would be nice. And then likewise, you can see while there are these really lovely annotations, these kind of designer notes throughout, again, in Daniel's same kind of conversational, easygoing style, giving some insights into what his intent was, what his recommendation was, just based on his experience in these rules. It does create an interesting formatting, maybe issue, where you can see while there are pages that have those annotations or notes on a photo that might exist, which is nice. I like these a lot. It does create pages like this, where you have that same margin, that same space on the side where it could host an annotation, but there's nothing there. So you have this, white space, which when you have like a page like this coupled with the front of the book, I was joking, kind of looks like a school workbook or textbook, then it gives it more of a textbook feel, even though the writing doesn't convey that at all. It feels, again, much more natural and easy to read. So I maybe would have liked either for these margins to disappear on pages where there's no designer's notes or notes on photos, or the one thing I really kind of feel was missing from the book compared to some other fantasy rule books I've read is some little illustrations, stuff that would, fill these margins, all this white space that exists on some of these pages. Because of course there's these lovely photos, which are all of beautifully painted models. I mentioned it's model agnostic, so you can use whatever models you want, and that's evident throughout the rule book, right? And there are, of course, a handful of illustrations throughout, like these, which are all full page and color, which all look great. However, what it is missing is just a feeling of fullness. Normally with a fantasy book, I want it to feel like it's almost overwhelming when you're looking at a page, because there's just so much stuff on the margins. Again, the designer's notes are great, but on a page like this, having just like a little illustration of like a skull with an arrow in it or something like that, right? Just to convey some more atmosphere, right? But again, the illustrations that are in here are really, really well done. And there are a couple that actually give me the feeling of like an 80s D&D monster manual, in terms of, again, going back to that concept of atmosphere. And while all the photos of the miniatures, they're really well painted, and they're all on battlefields, so it kind of gives you a good idea of what we're doing here. Even some different scales here, as might be inferred from the size of some of the miniatures. But it's quite literal, right? If you have just photos of miniatures on a battlefield, that is what we're doing. Whereas if you have illustrations like this, it allows you to kind of use your imagination. Well, how would I represent that on a tabletop? This is probably my favorite illustration in the whole book, actually. But again, all the illustrations that are here are very nice. The photos that are here are very nice. I would have just liked maybe some more illustrations, just to litter the margins, so to speak. But other than that, this is such an easy read, and it's such a reasonably priced rule book with very approachable rules that are incredibly modifiable. You know, I did that back in college where we were playing Lord of the Rings, and we had like basically a whole, I don't know, 20-page document that we used as supplemental rules to make it more of a immersive, like medieval rule set. And I feel like this is just such a solid foundational like starting point that you could then adapt with your own rules if you wanted to. One other cool thing about it that's sort of implied by what we've been talking about, model agnostic, that the sample warbands in the back are just some examples, is it's everything you need in one book, right? That you don't need to buy like a supplemental army book for, say, the elves to go along with this, like some of us might be used to doing from some other companies. You just pay the $20 for the one rule book. You can get all the rules and all the rules you need for building an army within the same document. Again, because it is designed to be modifiable, you can do whatever you want with it. And it's a really cool thing, again, to be able to use your own models, to buy one book, and then to build an army up with that is a neat thing. The only other thing that is missing, and this is actually incidentally missing from a lot of fantasy rulebooks, is a index. And by which I mean it would be a alphabetized list at the end that would show, for example, the word venomous. If it came up in a game, you would then see, oh, venomous is on page 47. And you could quickly flip back to venomous, because these fantastical rules are probably where that would come up the most in-game as something you would need to quickly reference. And so that's missing here. Fortunately, the fantastical rules section is like 7 pages long, including this magic section. So it's not that hard to find if you already know that the fantastical rules are between a certain section. And the book itself, I mentioned, is not that long. It's not like we're talking about a 300-page rule book here that you would need to sift through. But generally, I like to have an index anyway, just as a quick reference sheet at the end. Speaking of which, they do have a reference sheet at the end, not with special rules breakdowns, but kind of like a basic overview of the kind of order of flow within a game. I didn't mention either, from a rules mechanic standpoint, that there's actually no phases to the game. Traditionally, if you're used to like a movement, shooting, magic phase, something like that, it is all activation based, like I said, and it's per unit. So you have an order for a unit to move, an order for a unit to shoot, order for a unit to attack, in this case, as your kind of like charge move, which makes sense because we kind of already do that within most game systems anyway. It's just split up over multiple phases. So to kind of compartmentalize, instead of phases, you have all of those phases within each unit's activation. I think that's really smart, and it allows for stuff like this, which is like a single reference sheet that actually give you a really good overview of the basic mechanics of the game. I don't think I mentioned actually that the print quality of this is really, really good, despite any concerns about, like the glued binding of it. This is normal Osprey publishing quality, where you've got this nice satiny finish to the pages. You don't see any like weird bleed happen even within full color illustrations like this on the page. There's no illustrations that cross over the gutter, so to speak. Like you wouldn't have this image split over 2 pages like you see sometimes from other publishers, and you create kind of this like unsightly seam within an image. All the images are within their own respective page, be it a photo or a painting, which I really appreciate. So what's the final verdict? I think this is a handy little rule set to have, again, for the price, $20 US, and that's the current MSRP. Who knows what it's actually going to go for on the website now that the second edition rules are out, and there's going to be probably no more printings of the first edition anyway. But it's so adaptable, it's so easy to read. Again, I read it in like an hour, and I think that this is a nice rule set to have, even if you don't intend to play it right away, right? To have just on your shelf to maybe reference someday down the road, to quickly have like a pickup game with somebody, maybe to introduce a new player to a game, or like I said, to build on, to adapt these rules, to maybe start adding some more complex immersive elements with your own rule set, like for use within a club or something like that. It's a nice, as this like art on the front is like a generic fantasy scene, this is a really lovely set of generic fantasy rules that you can use however you want. It makes me very eager to see the second edition rules, to see how they've kind of built on this foundation here, what's improved, what's changed. So we'll be taking a look at that here shortly. Massive thanks yet again to Osprey for sending this over to us. Really appreciate it, and I'm eager to see some of the other rule books within the collection. Again, I mentioned that there's the Dragons Rampant 2nd edition. I really want to see Lion Rampant now to see what the differences are between that rule set and this. I imagine it's mostly the Fantastical rules section, maybe some of the scenarios as well, but I'm eager to actually go through it to see, even to have the different pictures within of like historical units instead of the fantasy miniatures that are within this rule set. But Dux Bellorum, we saw some of the other examples on the front cover there of game systems like Ronin, Gods and Mortals, things like that. But they also do Oathmark, they do Frostgrave. There's a 2nd edition of Oathmark coming out here soon. I think they also publish Bolt Action, if I'm not mistaken. So there's lots to see from the Osprey Rulebook publishing arm, and I'll be trying to get my hands on as much of it as I can. Appreciate you again, Osprey, for sending this over to us. I appreciate all of you for dropping by for this one in the meantime. And until next time, happy gaming.